From a paper by Maggie Mitchell, she moves forward now to October 25th, 1774 in Edenton. And she says, and this is very important, unfortunately, she writes, there is very little primary evidence recording the events of October 25th, 1774. We basically have to have, it's like folklore, folk music, if you've understood that history of it. It's basically stories passed on through history, and you have to kind of look and see the similarity from different people at the time. But there's a little bit of a legendary tale that goes with this as well. She says, however, there are narratives that retell the story, although they vary in some of the details. By examining the general narrative and comparing the varying details, it is evident that not only was the Edenton Tea Party an intentional political action, it was the first recorded, first organized women's political protest, political action in American history. There may have been others, we just don't know if they existed. So this is the first one that we're aware of. They say that the traditional tale is not necessarily the most accurate. She goes on, she says, the timing of the Edenton Tea Party shows that the women were politically informed on the North Carolina Provincial Congress, because we know that in August they had passed this. They sent the representatives to the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress issued resolutions on October 14th, and then the boycott, the Continental Association, on the 20th, so just 5 days later. And they probably had been planning things. That's what we can assume. They'd all been communicating, well, we need to do something as well. It can't just be the men organizing and planning these things, because women in our society, they often were in charge of the household. They were in charge of purchasing. They held more of the tea parties. Tea was, for example, was consumed far more by women than by men at the time, even though we know people like John Adams and others actually drank tea. But they recognized that they could have some economic impact. And at the time, the idea of an economic boycott was so important. That's why even in the previous resolutions, we're talking about a ramp up. Like here, on this date, we're going to do this. On this date, we're going to do that. And they even took it to the next level in North Carolina. They said, and after that, if anybody doesn't follow with what the Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress, what their boycott is going to do, because they didn't know exactly what it was going to be. If any other colony, we're going to cut off trade, exports, and imports from those other colonies as well. They were really willing to go it alone in North Carolina. So Maggie is very correct when she says, look, this is interesting timing here. They clearly knew what was going on. They were aware of that North Carolina Congress and the Continental Congress as well. Now, in accordance with the traditional narrative, for those of you who may have heard about this, Maggie writes, the Edenton Tea Party occurred on October 25th, 1774, at the home of Elizabeth King in Edenton, North Carolina. Penelope Barker presided for this meeting that she called on October 23rd, with Winifred Hoskins, or Sarah Hoskins, as the secretary for the meeting. So we are generally confident that the organizers were Penelope Barker and Sarah Winifred Hoskins. It was probably called for just a few days in advance. We know that the Continental Association was passed on the 20th. They probably called for it within a few days. Hey, let's organize. That means they were very likely planning something out like this after the First Provincial Congress in North Carolina. But there were 51 women who signed on to this statement, these resolutions. We could call them the Edenton Resolves. The interesting point is, Elizabeth King actually wasn't a signatory, so we don't necessarily know if they all met at her house. And I've read some historians who said, just as a quick side note, her home was way too small. Like, these were mostly pretty prominent, wealthy ladies. But even Elizabeth King's home was not big enough to hold 51 people. It's possible that maybe they were out in a yard, or maybe they just said that and they were at a local tavern. Who knows? But here's the interesting point. Not only did all 51 women attend the meeting in King's home, this is according to the traditional narrative, and thereafter sign the petition to boycott British goods, Barker supposedly said directly after the meeting this famous quote. Well, it should be famous. Maybe it has only been the men who have protested the king up to now. That only means we women have taken too long to let our voices be heard. Now, again, there is no primary verification that this was actually stated. It's folklore. We can't verify it. But even if it wasn't the exact statement, it certainly summed up the mentality of the people who were doing what they were doing. There was a greater risk for women to put their neck on the line in a situation like this in many ways. So what we do know, they absolutely did pass resolutions. We know that there was a signed document. We know that it was sent to London for publication. We know that at least some of them met in a house or in a tavern. And we know that this petition was circulated and it was signed by 51 different people. And I can pull up the resolution text here in just a moment here. This was how it was published on November 3rd, 1774 in the Virginia Gazette. And I know you can't read this, but I thought it was just cool to have a printout of the original paper. There's some scans out there, Library of Congress as well. This was from American Revolution NC, North Carolina, a history site that has a lot of great North Carolina history, but it's a very short resolution. It says, as we cannot be indifferent on any occasion that appears nearly to affect the peace and happiness of our country, and as it has been thought necessary for the public good to enter into several particular resolves by a meeting of members deputed from the whole province, they're referring to that August 27th meeting, it is a duty which we owe not only to our near and dear connections who have concurred in them, but to ourselves who are essentially interested in their welfare, to do everything as far as lies in our power to testify our sincere adherence to the same, and we do therefore accordingly subscribe this paper as a witness of our fixed intention and solemn determination to do so. So they were basically reaffirming what was passed in New Bern just a little while earlier, saying, look, on January of the following year, we are fully on board with no purchase of imported British goods at all. And if you guys don't back off, we are fully on board with supporting an export ban and then even trade sanctions against the other colonies. Now, at that point, it may have been a dead letter because, of course, it's unfortunate, but it's a fact of the time. Women were not given or held in the same regard in political actions. All the great writing by people like Mercy Otis Warren, Abigail Adams, and others, even in the letters back and forth, and if you've read this, you can honestly understand what I'm talking about. But Abigail will write a really badass statement about the rights of people, all people, women, men, whatever, on the nature of power. She told Adams, her husband, at some point, like, look, don't forget the ladies, because at some point we're going to rise up and this is going to be over. And he basically scoffed at her. It was a mentality of getting the kitchen woman. You get that quite a bit. And we know she expressed her frustration to Mercy and others in other correspondence. And so it could have been a dead letter at this point, even though it was published just shortly later in the Virginia Gazette. But I think Penelope Barker, it was very likely, we don't know for sure it was her, but Penelope Barker seemed to have been a very savvy person. Her husband was a prominent lawyer who was actually the agent for the colony of North Carolina. He was actually in London. So she had connections there, and she knew she had to get the word out. So she sent her and probably Sarah and maybe others. Maybe they all planned it out. I don't know. There is just no verification. But what we do know is that it eventually made its way to London along with a letter. On January 16th, 1775, they sent a letter, and let me pull this up here. And they added, before they included the statement, the actual resolution, that short paragraph that I just read, with all the names, all the signatures, there are 51 below it in 2 columns that were published. They sent this letter. And it says, the provincial deputies of North Carolina, having resolved not to drink any more tea, nor wear any more British cloth, etc., many ladies of this province have determined to give a memorable proof of their patriotism, and have accordingly entered into the following honorable and spirited association. I send it to you to show you, fair countrywomen, how zealously and faithfully American ladies follow the laudable example of their husbands, and what opposition your matchless ministers may expect to receive from a people thus firmly united against them. It is a reiteration that everyone is on board. You're not going to break apart this resistance between husband and wife in family. There's going to be strength, there's going to be unity, and when you get that, you guys are going to have a lot of problems. So this ended up being published on January 16th. This whole letter, this introduction, the resolution, the names of all the people who were signatories in the Morning Chronicle. Now, it wasn't well received there, and just days later, looks like about 2 weeks later, January 31st, 1775, a guy named Arthur Iredell. You may be familiar with the name James Iredell. Well, his younger brother, 17-year-old teenager, kind of a cocky dude, he was living in London at the time, and he read this, and so he sent this. This is from J.L. Bell's great history website, Boston 1775. J.L. is awesome, writing especially on Massachusetts and Revolutionary time history, one of my favorite blogs to read. He puts it this way. On January 31st, 75, Iredell's 17-year-old brother Arthur sent him a letter from London, mostly about why he hadn't written earlier and about his own studies and law books. But Arthur also noticed rare news from Edenton in the Morning Chronicle. At least I assume he saw it there, since I found no evidence it was reprinted widely in the British press. Arthur wrote, I see by the newspapers that the Edenton ladies have signalized themselves by their protest against tea drinking. So he goes on and he basically mocks them. He's like, oh, you know, this is the fair sex. We better be careful. It's that old trope with, oh, if they withhold what they've got, we're going to lose. We've got no chance. And it's kind of mocking it. It's a little bit unfortunate, especially considering the family that he's from and that this is his own people there that he's talking about. But I guess the closer you are to the empire, the more likely you are to mock people who want to resist it. And that was his attitude. That was on January 31st, 1775. Then, a little bit later, just in March of 1775, we had this cartoon, I guess. What do you call this? Political illustration published? For those of you watching, I've pulled up this image on the screen. This is a replication. This is a print of the original. This was published on March 25th, 1775 by a guy named Philip Daw. And again, to Maggie Mitchell, this is how she describes it. This was intended to mock the people. And she writes, he drew the women in this picture to intentionally look disfigured and resemble men. Not only were they disfigured, but the women in the cartoon were drawn with a condescending flair, and so were their actions. They were portrayed as unfit mothers, as shown with the child playing unattended underneath the table. One of the women signing the petition is entertaining a male suitor that is presumably not her husband, thus portraying the women as promiscuous. The woman in the back is drawn drinking from a bowl and ignoring proper societal norms. The dough-faced slave in the picture is not shown as serving, but fraternizing with the ladies. Finally, in the bottom right corner, and I'm not sure if you can see this on the screen. Yeah, I think so. There is a dog urinating on one of the ladies in a blatant sign of British disrespect for the ladies of Edenton. So this was really just done. Oh, there we go. Look, you can see the dog peeing on the lady. And they did this on purpose, basically, and they published this. I'm not sure what paper it was originally published in, but basically it was to mock. Okay, yeah, so you guys do this, but whatever. We're the empire. This is hubris. This is, I mean, it's really just awful how that's how it was, but that's how it was. But at the end of the day, honestly, even though they were mocked, they were rejected, they were ridiculed, I think my understanding is they really held fast on this. They participated, and I think they encouraged other people as well. I think the Edenton Tea Party really was significant, not only because it encouraged others to join the boycott, the protest, encouraged other people to do the same, other women to actually step up and make their voice more heard. It was the first recorded in American history public protest and political action ever.